Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Kim Carroll Steward. I am the Executive Director at Nebraska Recycling Council. I always like to start my talks to talk a little bit about myself and my organization. I am a mixed method researcher. I really like qualitative research, and we kind of take this thing of who we are, what we do is the lens in which we look through the world. And so that's kind of why I start here. So Nebraska Recycling Council is a statewide member-based organization. Our mission is to maximize the economic and environmental benefit of resource recovery in the state of Nebraska. We really envision a future where all materials are reserved for best and highest use, where landfill disposal is then the last resort, right? So we follow a waste hierarchy. Some people talked about that already. That's where we base a lot of our education on. We do this through a couple of different realms. And so we provide technical assistance. This is to all levels. So from the citizen that has a question about where a battery goes, to a county or even state level that wants to know data, wants to know who I can work with, who's doing this in the state. We do education outreach events. All 4 of my staff have an event today, including myself. We advocate, we do not lobby. I always make that very clear. So we come in with a lot of education to our legislative teams, just to provide that good knowledge, give them the terminology so that they don't always say drink the Kool-Aid when the lobbyists get there. Historically, we provide some funding to other agencies and partners, as well as collect our own data and do research. And so I guess just a quick show of hands, has everyone heard of EPR? Okay, 50-50. So the idea of EPR, extended producer responsibility, is really to reduce the burden of managing products at end of life. So we know there's a cost, right? So when something is created, we consume it, something happens to it. Ideally, we have a circular economy. We don't have the take, make, landfill option, that linear economy. And so I pulled this infographic here. I think it's one of the better ones that I've seen. It kind of shows this retail, consume, recycle, produce circle, right? And so that's the goal. For us, we really framed this around what local governments could benefit from, and at that end of life cost, because in our current system, that's really who is eating that cost right now. Companies that produce those products are now the ones who shoulder that, burden that cost. And in the ideal world, EPR incentivizes a company to design a product with sustainability in mind. So we design for the end of life or end of use. I have some concerns on that depending on how some things go, but that is the goal, right? So there's eco-modulation, and that's a whole different concept. But there's an eco-modulation fee. So the better, easier in the current system that you can recycle, recoup that value, the lower your fee is as a producer. So it incentivizes that action. So setting the scenes, I don't know how many people are familiar with Nebraska here. I always like to start with unique challenges, unique opportunities, and then my final slide is just unique. So looking at your state, and I say take this back to your own states, kind of build out this structure for everything, kind of what you're doing in your place. We have a lot of rural land. So in Nebraska, both of our major cities are within an hour of each other on the eastern part of the state. Omaha, Lincoln, that's about 60% of our population, and then everybody else. So we have a lot of rural, a lot of ranching, a lot of ag happening in our state. As a whole, we have a really low population. I think we're under, I'm gonna test myself, under 2 million total. So we have a pretty small population as compared to others of kind of around the country. Long hauling distances, things get expensive. We have people hauling basically from Colorado, edge of Nebraska there, the whole way over to Omaha. So clear across the state because that is where our major MRF is located. And then limited economies of scale. So that is to say, I always joke with our Western people, if you were creating the same amount of waste as our Omaha folks, I would be very concerned. I'm glad you're not, but it does bring some challenges into creating those systems. So some unique opportunities. We have a really strong agricultural base. We have a really strong manufacturing base. And I say this with as much love. I am not from Nebraska, but we have a culture of practicality. So efficiency, local control, and financial kind of fiscal responsibility. We like to keep things kind of local. We are extremely conservative leaning state, and so that probably resonates for the rest of you that are in conservative leaning states. Don't necessarily want the government to tell us what to do. We want to have that control at our local level. I personally view that as an opportunity that could be in the challenge category as well. And then just unique to Nebraska. So we are actually a unicameral. So for anyone who doesn't know what that means, we have only a single chamber in our state. We don't have a House and a Senate. We have one group of 49, and we all call them senators. So just one group, which is really nice when you are trying to educate. You only have to teach those 49 people. They all work together. It's not moving between House and Senate. Things are kind of operating all in one group. So there's a lot more transparency, a lot more clarity. You kind of know where people stand from the start. A lot less of the kind of dealings and things that can happen when you're kind of moving between two groups. The other thing that I really like, and it's kind of unique, it's not probably solely to Nebraska, but any bill that's introduced in our state legislation is given a hearing through their committee. So that means that any bill that anyone brings forward has a public hearing where public is allowed to come in and speak either for, against, or neutral. And so that is a really great way to advocate and educate and really get a sense of what other people are thinking that are operating in the state. And so we actually started with batteries. So LB 36 is our battery EPR bill. It also has a few other things in there. It started as a different bill number and then transitioned, became a priority bill, and was carried through in 2025. Our full implementation happens in 2028. And so batteries are really selected because we were able to frame our kind of messaging around some things that actually the previous speaker teed me up perfectly, mainly safety and then cost. So economic value, both in the cost of fire, but then also in the recoverable value of those materials. In some ways it worked out that we had a lot of that federal conversation going on a critical value, our critical minerals, and not wanting to rely on other things. So it kind of heightened that recycling system. So that gave us a lot of messaging that we could use. So safety-wise, high risk, high impact. I have a couple different photos here. We actually just had a recycling center fire last week in Lincoln. Was fairly large fire. Battery got into the cardboard area. The two photos of the kind of the vape devices and the laptop are actually from a local landfill that we work a lot with. He has so many fires at this point that he's actually started spreading every load out in about 6-inch depth and having someone walk through it quick. These are just from one load. And so he sends me photos every couple of days of what they're pulling off the load. Some of these are coming from people that should know better already. Other ones are just general things that are coming into his landfill. But he's really trying to mitigate that risk and doing some extra work to get around that. And then I say relatively, I'm gonna put that in quotes, straightforward. So if we look at other EPR laws, things like plastics, packaging, textiles, there's a lot more that goes into those. Whereas batteries are kind of discrete products. A little bit easier to identify for both general public and then kind of the recyclers themselves, and they're tied directly to manufacturers. So it creates a little bit of a cleaner system. So for us, kind of advocating for an EPR in our state, knowing that we have kind of this challenge of not wanting to look too green on anything, that it allows us to kind of say like, hey, here's a nice thing. We can get some great success, and then we can move forward with other products in the future. So why this worked in Nebraska, and what I really suggest, I have some like practical tips kind of at the end of the second half of this. But we really had a champion. So we have Senator Hughes is our main senator that we work with. I'm kind of looking for some other ones. She has another term to get elected, and then she'll be terming out. But she was really our champion, knows how to work a bill, knows the people, great community builder. And we also framed it in this practical, non-controversial way, right? So if we come at it from, my background is in natural resources, forestry, wildlife. And so if we come at it from that side, we have that risk of sounding a little bit too green. But if we frame it as public safety, no one wants to be the person that's like, I don't care about that, right? And so we're framing it in a way that they understand. I say sometimes it's like speaking a couple different languages. And so we really approach it from public safety. One of the coalitions we did early on was getting our rural fire departments, police departments, all of them on board and saying, hey, this is what we're trying to do. What do you think? How is this impacting you? Are you seeing these things in your community? It's a resounding yes. We worked with our League of Municipalities. We worked with insurance companies, which is a one that people forget about, but these have to be insured facilities. Some of them are getting close to the point of uninsurable, and so they had a vested interest in joining our group early on. We looked at resource recovery, supply chain security, again, looking at those kind of good manufacturers. Cost relief for local government was another big one in our state. And then when the audience was right, environmental. So talking to our ranchers, in the way of you want to protect your land, you want to protect your water. We don't want these chemicals to get into your systems. That's a direct impact on your kind of bottom line as well. And so kind of recommendations and kind of what I will say, I'm not going too deep into our actual bill, but I'll be here the rest of the time if you want to hear more about our bill and how we structured it. Pick a starting point, what product, what material. Again, suggest picking something that has some good delineation, some good edges to it that is not going to get into the kind of, I say, avoid packaging, avoid textiles if you can, especially if this is your first kind of round with this. Know your audience, go through that list, figure out your state's opportunities, your challenges, and what just makes you unique, and frame things around that. Find your champions and build your coalitions early. Have those meetings early and often. So I kind of fell into my position as this was starting, and so I took my job. One of my first meetings was meeting with the senator and talking and saying like, okay, what are we doing? Who have we brought in? So really build that coalition. I'm reading a book right now called Team of Rivals. It's about Abraham Lincoln, but bring in people that you think are going to challenge you at the very beginning, because they're going to show you your blind spots, and then it's going to allow you to figure out how to talk to them and talk to that blind spot. If they have a concern, somebody else is going to have it too. And so just really that relationship, building that rapport. And like I said, that's my last point there too, is find that opposition. We were very fortunate in our state that we had very, very little opposition to this. We had one group kind of come forward. Turned out they didn't operate in our state. Our senator was strong enough to say like, you're not here. It doesn't really matter what your opinion is. Come back to us when you're here. When you're doing something on the ground in our state, and then we can talk and have that conversation. But they decided not to, and so we kind of move forward with that. Identify concerns and misconceptions, so educate yourself so you can educate others. Look at critical elements kind of a strong policy. So statewide access requirements, sometimes called convenience standards, figure those out, what they're gonna be. It's always easier to build them in the front end than it is to try to come back and do an amendment. I think we'll probably end up doing some amendments with some of our convenience standards, just depending on how our system rolls out. Know kind of who in batteries. It's going to be a BSO, battery stewardship organization. It could be a pro as well, producer responsibility organization. But kind of figure out who that might be at the head of time, and again, bring them into the conversation, right? If they're going to be the ones managing your system, you want to make sure, one, that they are reliable, but two, that you're using terminology that's going to work both in your state but in for their system. If you're getting into the area of eco-modulation fees, have those discussions again early and often. I am a big data person, so transparent reporting and accountability. So working with partners that are able to share that. I get so tired of the confidential business information answer when I ask questions. And so find those people that are willing to share that information. And then don't be too rigid. So be flexible, have some harmonization, standardization, so you can roll that out. Look at public education. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're actually building out a voluntary network ahead of the 2028 deadline, so that when 28 hits, our organization, my organization, has a packet that we can hand to the BSO that says, hey, these guys are good operators. They're already doing it. Here's the data. Here's what we know. We're about 60% of the state signed on right now as far as convenience standards, and this is our first year running that. And so we're going to grow it next year as well. But we already are starting to build some of that transparency, that flexibility. We're figuring out what doesn't work and works before our bill even rolls into a full effect. And so this is the last thing too, kind of design with the end in mind. So know what your definition of success is going to look like. That's going to be one of the big questions you get when you're approaching people, is like, well, how do I know it's working? How do I know they're not just taking stuff and making money and on the back end? So kind of what we looked at is, are we going to increase access across our state? Are we going to reduce contamination, which in turn is going to reduce fires, ideally? Are we lowering those costs? How do we get those fees? We're in the rulemaking process right now. And so we're kind of talking through some other states that are ahead of us by a year or two, and saying, okay, what mistakes did you make? How can we make sure that we are actually going to lower our costs for municipalities? Because if it doesn't work, that kills EPR in our state, right? We need this to be successful so that we can do another material later on. And then if you get into that packaging space, are you making that kind of qualifier of designing with the end in mind, and then transparency as always. So engage early and often, build those coalitions, support data and pilot. You don't have to wait for an EPR to come to your state to start something now. Sometimes you got to work from the ground up. Sometimes you can work from the top down. But both of those things, everyone has a piece in that puzzle. And so that's how we get it going. Champion your practical local driven solutions, especially if you're in a conservative leaning state, and keep going. And I don't think in 2025, when we brought this forward and our group kind of started working on this, that anyone thought we would pass it in 1 year. That was one of our first meetings, like, hey, great idea, right? But do you know where you're at? And is this really going to happen? And so we still are kind of in shock that we got it done in 1 year. Part of that, I think, is the unicameral and some of our other things, but we had a really great champion. And so with that, I'm just going to pop my contact information here. I'll be around, so if you want to know more specifics on LB36 or any of the things that we're doing rolled out, this is my little team. We're a group of 4 of us. There's a phone, email, kind of find us, reach out. We're always happy to consult and chat, and we do a lot of other programs as well.